So, what if some of the healthiest foods you're eating every single day are actually driving inflammation, weight gain, and maybe even autoimmune disease? Well, today we're going to take a deep dive in this topical and controversial topics in terms of nutrition. And I'm sitting down today with a physician who's challenged everything we've been taught about food, the gut, chronic disease. And this conversation today may actually change what's on your plate. Dr. Gundry, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. And great first name, by the way.
Yes, I agree with you. Most Steves I know are pretty good, and you're one of those. So that's awesome. Thanks so much for that. Dr. Stephen Gundry is a former thoracic surgeon turned restorative medicine physician and a New York Times bestselling author of The Plant Paradox and many other awesome healthy books about gut health, longevity, and metabolic disease. Through decades of clinical practice, he has developed an approach that focuses on lectins, microbiome, and inflammation, and helping thousands of patients transform their health through targeted nutrition and lifestyle strategies. So you started out as a thoracic surgeon, not a nutrition expert. What was that moment that made you question everything that you thought you knew about food and disease?
Well, I got to go way back. In the dark ages, I got into Yale University. And back in the dark ages, we actually were allowed to design our own major. And it was basically kind of a master's program where you could work with a couple of full professors and you'd have a thesis and you'd literally write a 10-page paper once a week and they'd review it. So I had a thesis that you could take a great ape, manipulate its food supply, manipulate its environment, and prove you would arrive at a human being. And I wrote my thesis, I defended my thesis, I got an honors for it, and I graduated and I gave it to my parents and went off to become a very famous heart surgeon. So with that background in mind, then let me tell you what happened. I forgot all about that. So as part of being a famous heart surgeon, I would often be referred people who were inoperable. They had so much plaque in their coronary arteries that there wasn't places to put stents. You couldn't do a bypass because everything was clogged up. And these people would go to idiots like me. And there were about, every year, there's about 5 or 6 idiots who will take these patients on. So in the mid 1990s, when I was professor and chairman at Loma Linda University of cardiothoracic surgery, I was referred to a gentleman from Miami who I call Big Ed in all my books. And Big Ed was a 48-year-old man, very obese, who had literally inoperable coronary artery disease. Everything's clogged up. And he had spent 6 months going around the country to various centers like the Texas Heart, Stanford, Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, Columbia, New York. And everyone turned him down. And he spent 6 months doing this. Then he finally arrived in my office, and I looked at his angiogram of 6 months earlier from Miami, the movie of his heart. And I said, I got to agree with everybody. They're right. There's nothing I can do for you. And he says, yeah, but wait a minute. It's been 6 months, and I've been on a diet. And I've lost 45 pounds in 6 months. And now this guy was 265 pounds when I'm talking to him, Big Ed. And I said, well, good for you for losing weight, but that's not going to do anything in here. And he says, yeah, but I've also been going to a health food store and I've been taking all of these supplements. And he literally had brought in a giant shopping bag full of these things. And I'm scratching my professor beard and I'm going, well, I know what you did with all those supplements. You made expensive urine, which is what I firmly believed back in those days. He said, look, what would it hurt? I've come all the way from Miami. I've been doing all this work for 6 months. Why don't we get a new angiogram? Why don't we get a new study of my heart? And I would go, don't get your hopes up, but sure. So we get a new angiogram the next morning, and this guy, in 6 months' time, has cleaned out 50% of the blockages in his coronary arteries. Now, he still had a number of blockages, but there were places I could put a bypass in now. And I said, great news. So I do a 5-vessel bypass on them, but I'm a researcher. And after we're done, I'm going, how'd you do that? And I said, tell me about this diet you were eating. And a few paragraphs into the diet, I go, time out. That's my thesis from Yale about what ancient man ate that turned him into a human. And then I go, let me see those supplements. Now, I was also very famous for protecting the heart during heart surgery from damage and from in heart transplant by putting a bunch of chemicals in the veins and arteries of the heart to protect the heart muscle. And as I'm looking through his assortment of goodies, a lot of the things that I was using to protect the heart, he was swallowing. And naively, it never occurred to me that I ought to swallow these things. Now, why it's so poignant is that even though I was a famous heart surgeon, I was running 30 miles a week, going to the gym 1 hour a day, eating a healthy, low-fat diet, because that's what heart surgeons do. And I was 70 pounds overweight. I had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, pre-diabetes, arthritis so bad I had to wear braces on my knees to run. And I would operate with migraine headaches, which my father had migraine headaches. So, and I'm going, boy, I'm doing a healthy lifestyle and look at me. So I put myself, I called my parents in San Diego. I said, hey, do you still have my thesis? And they said, oh yeah, it's in the shrine, next to the eternal flame. I said, well, send it up to me. So I put myself on my thesis and I started swallowing a bunch of these plant chemicals, polyphenols. And I lost 50 pounds my first year and another 20 subsequently. I've kept it off now for 30 years. And all of my issues went away. My high blood pressure went away, my cholesterol issues went away, my prediabetes went away, my arthritis went away, and my migraines went away. So I would operate on people at Loma Linda. And then I'd send them home a little list saying, okay, here, I want you to eat this, don't eat this. Go to a health food store, go to Costco, go to Trader Joe's. There wasn't any Amazon. And I want you to buy, some of these supplements. And I want you to start taking them. And sure enough, my longtime nurse and I remember couple of weeks after they'd go home, they'd go, wow, I'm really dizzy. And most people would go home on 3 blood pressure medications, as an example, and 2 diabetes drugs. And I would go, well, get in here. And sure enough, their blood pressure was really low. And their blood sugars were a lot lower. And we go, well, son of a gun, let's stop some of these things, or let's reduce it. And the pattern would just repeat itself. So after a year of doing this at Loma Linda, I looked in the mirror one Friday, which my wife still calls Black Friday, not for a good reason. And I said, I'm doing the wrong thing. Instead of operating on people and then teaching them how to eat so I don't have to be operating on them again, I should teach them how to eat. And I'll never have to operate on them in the first place. Now, that's a really bad career choice for a heart surgeon. But, at 50, at the height of my career, I resigned my position at Loma Linda and moved down the road to Palm Springs and set up a clinic where I said, hey, you want to play? I'm a researcher. We can get labs on you every 3 months that Medicare and insurance will pay for. Here's a list of things to eat, not to eat, and go take these supplements and let's see what happens. And the rest is history. I nearly starved to death, as my wife likes to remind me. And it, eventually resulted in the plant paradox. The weird thing is I still see people 6 days a week. I just saw people before, but came on right now, and I'll see people later this afternoon. I see people on Saturdays and Sundays. On the 7th day, which is Friday, I'm at Gundry MD, which is in LA, working on my supplement time. And why do I keep, I'm about to turn 76, and why do I keep doing this? Because literally, I get to see miracles every day. Something that I would have easily called a miracle, like Big Ed, 30 years ago. And why wouldn't I get up, to see a miracle, right? And
100%. That's a great, I love your story there because you're right. It's amazing what you can do in changing patients and some supplements, some lifestyle, diet, and that type of stuff. And I've been following your work for a long time, been preaching and teaching a lot of the things you've been doing. But I would say one thing that kind of caught me off guard is when you dropped your book, The Plant Paradox, and started reading about the lectin thing and that effect. It's one thing to change somebody's diet, but even some of the quote unquote healthy things that we would say you should eat, you're saying not so fast. Was there a specific case or pattern that made you realize this whole lectin thing was something bigger?
Yeah, and believe it or not, that it really gets back to early man and what we were exposed to. And one of the things, that clearly we started as a plant predator. We were of the great ape lineage, and maybe we'll get into one of the mutations that made great apes great that we inherited from them. We used to call it the thrifty gene. We now know it's not the thrifty gene. It's the great ape mutation. They stopped making an enzyme called uricase, and fructose is normally detoxified and turned into uric acid, but uricase then breaks uric acid down. Great apes lost the ability to make uricase, and this really gets into a rabbit hole. But anyhow, great apes could eat fruit, which had fructose in it, and convert fructose into triglycerides, which is the first storage form of fat, and uric acid. And uric acid is really good at producing insulin resistance. So you have the perfect 1-2 punch to store fat for the winter. And this was a time of climate change about 10 million years ago when this mutation occurred. And monkeys did not have this mutation. So great apes could outcompete monkeys because forests receded, and they could store fat for bad times and monkeys couldn't. So they could make it from forest to forest, and that's actually how they became great. We inherited that mutation from great apes. We thought it was the thrifty gene because humans can go a long time without eating them. But now we know it's this great ape mutation. So that aside, we were plant predators, but the plants that we were exposed to were strictly in Africa and some parts of Europe and Eurasia. And up until 500 years ago, none of us were from the Americas. So all Europeans, all Asians, all Africans were never exposed to a North or South American plant. And with Columbian trade, so named for Christopher Columbus, all of us suddenly started being exposed to plants that we had no identity. Plus, from the historical record, none of our ancestors ate a grain until 10, 12,000 years ago. And there's an interesting aside that if we have time, we'll talk about why we probably started eating grains, and it wasn't to eat them, it was to brew them, but it's another stuff. So we were never exposed to major lectin-containing compounds that we didn't know for millions of years. And we now know that our microbiome is a major part of the defense system against plant compounds that wish to do us harm. Simplistically, plants were here first. They had it great. It was the Garden of Eden for plants because nobody wanted to eat them. Insects were the first plant predator. And when insects arrived, plants had no natural defense systems. They couldn't run, they couldn't hide, they couldn't fight. But they were chemists, as any pharmacist knows, of incredible ability. And as you know, almost most pharmaceutical compounds have a basis in plant chemistry. And so they use biological warfare to make their predators think twice about eating them. And one of the interesting things about lectins is that lectins are really good at paralyzing insects. They prevent neurotransmission. And if an insect can't move, it's a good defense mechanism. And so lectins and other plant compounds like oxalates, like phthalates, if an animal didn't feel well, or if an animal wasn't thriving, and then a smart animal would say, geez, every time I eat these plants or these plant babies, I'm not doing well, and I'm not going to eat those. Humans are pretty stupid. And so when we eat these compounds, thanks to pharmacists like you, we can take compounds to make us feel better while we're feeling like crap. And that's part of our problem. So grains were really kind of the original mischief makers, and humans actually shrunk about a foot over a 2,000-year period when we started agriculture. Pretty impressive. Then when Columbian trade started, we were exposed to nightshades, which we'd never been exposed to. We were exposed to corn, which we were never exposed to. And we didn't learn from Native Americans how they had learned to detoxify the various lectins in these foods and make them edible. And the history of conquerors not learning from the conquered, it's worth a book in itself.
Gotcha. So you were working with patients, improving diet, and some of the things that would be considered healthy, i.e. healthy whole grains. Was there a time, though, or a certain patient story that you had that you kind of figured this lectin connection that was maybe like, okay, I've got to take a deeper dive in these nightshades and those type things, corn? Was there something in particular that, because you're right. I mean, most people would think, okay, eat a Mediterranean diet, which we've got a lot of studies to show how healthy it is and all. But you go one step beyond that because it's like, whoa, there's a little more deeper here. What's your take on that?
Yeah, actually, one of the guys who really changed what really made me do a deep dive into this is I have a friend who's still a personal friend who had vitiligo. And he's a very handsome man, but he had vitiligo on his face and he had vitiligo on his hands. And very healthy, athletic, nice guy, healthy, who I call Tony in my book. And I got into autoimmune disease because I was a transplant immunologist. And I ran the transplant immunology lab at Loma Linda. Why? Because I wanted to figure out how to put a pig's heart in a baboon and have it survive for more than 5 hours. And so I had to learn what the immune system was looking for and how to fool the immune system. So when I got into what I'm doing now, after my first book, Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution in the early 2000s, where I described a couple people with autoimmune diseases who went into remission, people started knocking on my door and say, hi, what do you know about autoimmune disease? And I go, I don't know anything about autoimmune disease, but I'm a transplant immunologist, and I know how the immune system works. So if you want to play, let's play. So getting back to Tony, vitiligo is an autoimmune disease. And you go, well, why would that be an autoimmune disease? Well, melanocytes are, believe it or not, nerve cells, nerve-derived cells that eventually end up in the skin. And I'm going, nerves. That's interesting. The original target for plants were nerve cells in insects. So I said, hey, Tony, would you mind if, you do a little experiment? Let's get rid of these compounds with lectins and let's see what happens. And he did. And within 6 months, his vitiligo was gone. Gone. Happy guy. Fast forward 5 years, and I run into him again, and his vitiligo's back. And I go, what the heck happened? And he says, oh, geez, that was really hard. And I said, well, yeah, but, look, vitiligo's back. I said, would you mind doing the experiment again? Maybe it was a fluke. He says, yeah, okay. So we did it again. Poof. 6 months, vitiligo's gone. And that really said, wow, these plant compounds were specifically designed to, target their predators. And, here's a perfect example. And
so that's a really cool story, which you just brought up, because you just said lectins, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute, how they affect the gut. But lectins had their impact. You got, let's take like grains, for instance. They got let's take like wheat. It's got gluten, which has an immunological aspect of things.
True.
Then you also, and you talked about your friend who got to eating again, which a lot of these grains have opioid-like compounds that make people want to eat them.
All
it's
right.
like the perfect disaster compound to help people get off track and have bad health. Is that kind of how you would see that?
Yeah, I mean, like most addictive substances, there's some wonderful stuff about them. And of course, most people enjoy the joke that all white powders are addictive, and that includes wheat and sugar. But yeah, they have negative consequences, but they often have a positive effect on mood or on an addictive quality that you will seek out despite the fact that you're miserable. I'll give you an example. The patient I just saw this morning was referred to me, who's on his horrible rheumatoid arthritis. He's on 2 transplant drugs, immunosuppressants. And as I tell any of my patients on these drugs, I said, look, I'm a transplant surgeon. I didn't put a heart in you. What in the ding dong are you doing on a transplant drug? And they go, huh? And I go, you don't have a kidney transplant. You don't have a heart transplant. You don't have a liver transplant. What are you doing on a transplant drug? And yet, so he's had 2 hip replacements. He just had his shoulder replaced. And he happens to love beer and loves beer. No, I mean, socially, he's absolutely not an alcoholic, but he loves beer. And when we now, thankfully, we can test for leaky gut, we can test for the substances that he reacts to. And he hates gluten. And I mean, he reacts to it very violently. Now, he doesn't have celiac disease, which is the extreme form, but we can measure leaky gut. And so I saw him initially last November, leaky gut, very high inflammation markers, despite being on these transplant drugs, which we usually see. And I said, well, you can't have any more beer. And he said, what do you mean? I love beer. I said, but beer is killing you. You're on 2 transplant drugs so that you can have a Coors, Light. And he said, oh, you got to be kidding me. I said, I've been at this for 30 years now. I wish I was kidding you. So I said, humor me. Give up beer. And I happen to know his wife. He said, yeah, I can do that. So I just saw him today for his kind of 3-month follow-up. And I said, he's got a high uric acid. I said, I'd be willing to bet you haven't given up beer. And he looks at me, he said, well, I'm drinking light beer. That has less gluten. And I'm going, you haven't given up beer, have you? He said, how did you know? And I said, well, your uric acid is high, but guess what? You still got a leaky gut. And you still got all these markers of gluten. And you've got, I said, it's still in you. He said, oh, come on. You mean to tell me that a couple of molecules of gluten are enough for me? I said, for you, yes, that's the bad news. And so we'll try again.
No, I hear you on that. So what you just said is a lot of people think, well, I'll cut down and minimize. But if you have that genetics, that biology that sets you up for that, I always use the analogy of like a flu shot, right? So you get a flu shot one time a year to cut on an immune response that can last you for months, right? That's one small exposure. It's the same immune system. It's one small exposure that cuts on that part. So you've talked about exposure to lectins and that effect, how it has like a Velcro effect on the gut lining. What is a real world consequence of that, as a matter of fact?
Well, as you probably noticed in the plant paradox, I made some rather bold statements that almost every disease, every term is caused by leaky gut and intestinal dysbiosis. You name the problem, I submit to you, it's caused by this. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, said all disease begins in the gut. I've been spending 30 years trying to figure out how he knew that. He was right. Alessio Fasano, the pediatric gastroenterologist who really quantified how this happens, how leaky gut, how to measure leaky gut, who's now at Harvard, stole a line from me and wrote a paper that Hippocrates was right. All disease begins in a leaky gut. I gave a paper in Paris and he stole, but I like him. He's a really funny guy. He's really smart. Anyhow, but that's right. Heart disease, it has nothing to do with cholesterol. Cholesterol is a spackling compound that when you have inflammation on the wall of your blood vessel caused by an autoimmune response, lectins are really good at binding to the glycocalyx of the heart, of the vessels. Then cholesterol patches this inflammation. It's like a pothole, and cholesterol patches it. Yeah, you can lower LDL cholesterol and show a little bit of a reduction. But what people don't talk about is that statin drugs are also anti-inflammatory drugs. And they block toll-like receptors, which I write about in the plant paradox, which are the immune system of telling you that there's inflammation and bringing white blood cells to the scene. Most people are now beginning to realize that Parkinson's, Alzheimer's is a result of neuroinflammation, and we're beginning to realize that neuroinflammation is a result of leaky gut starting this process. All autoimmune diseases are caused by what's now called molecular mimicry. Even type 1 diabetes is molecular mimicry. So, in my last book, The Gut-Brain Paradox, depression, anxiety, it's all intestinal dysbiosis and leaky gut. And you can watch addictions are actually part of this process that I wrote about. You choose the issue.
So let me ask you this. You brought up Alessio Fasano, and I agree. And I've heard you talk about pretty much everybody who eats gluten has some leaky gut, gastrointestinal hyperpermeability that happens with it. In your opinion, lectins, is this the same thing for everybody, or can some people eat lectins and some people can't? What's your take on that?
Well, so I mentioned earlier that traditional cultures have usually figured out a way to lessen the impact of lectins, usually by fermentation. Now, one of the bad news, now gluten is a lectin. One of the bad news about gluten is, I'm sorry, there's lots of papers. Fermentation does not break gluten. It doesn't. Sourdough bread is no safer than regular bread. I wish it was, but it's not. You cannot break the dumb gluten molecule with fermentation. Pressure cooking usually breaks lectins, but the gluten molecule cannot be broken by pressure cooking either. Believe me, we've tried with our patients. But fermentation, for the most part, really breaks down lectins. So, fermentation, and for instance, 8 billion people use rice as their staple, and yet 8 billion people take the hull off of rice that contains the lectins and eat white rice. And if brown rice was so good for you, how come 8 billion people are that stupid that they took the hull off of the rice? Well, it was to get rid of the lectin. The Native Americans, for instance, peppers are an American food. The Southwest American Indians always peeled and de-seeded their peppers before they ate them or ground them into pepper. The Italians, up until recently, always peeled and de-seeded their tomatoes to get rid of the lectins. The French always peel and de-seed their cucumbers to get rid of the lectins. And I could go on and on. There's a lectin in the skin of almonds, and traditional cultures in Spain and Portugal, the mothers teach their daughters to soak the peel off of almonds to make a blanched almond or a Marcona almond, and so on and so forth. Corn is an amazing story. Corn was traditionally boiled in lime juice to remove the hull, where most of the lectins are. And it also kept corn from binding niacin, which is another interesting story. So the resulting product was pasole, or hominy. And then you would grind hominy to make hominy grits. And then you would grind grits to make masa harina flour. And traditionally, you would only have a tortilla made of masa harina flour, which was detoxified corn. Now, the Spaniards didn't know this. So they brought corn back to Europe. And corn grows extremely well in northern Italy. And the Italians did not know this trick. So for a number of generations after corn was introduced to Italy, there was an epidemic of children being born with microcephaly, small brains. And they were called cretins. And cretinism, we now know, was because they were eating corn that hadn't been treated. And they did not have enough niacin for brain development. And I'm a student of history. The French, which border Italy, said, holy cow, look at those stupid Italians. They're eating corn and they're all dumb. We're going to outlaw corn for humans to eat. And you can only feed corn to pigs. That's why if you actually go to France, you'll notice it's very unusual to see corn on menus. We just didn't learn. The Incas detoxified their wonderful healthy grain by fermenting it. And, now quinoa is so healthy, but it's got a horrible lectin in it. But if you ferment it, the lectin is taken care of.
That's interesting. So, in working with the thousands of patients you've worked with, do you find, is there certain things that make certain people more sensitive to lectins, gut damage, genetics, microbiome? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, and that's what I talked about, that some people don't read. The 7 deadly disruptors. So way back when, we had a fantastic microbiome that liked to eat lectins. There are microbes that love gluten. They love oxalates. They think they're delicious. But our antibiotic use, thanks to you, no. The antibiotic use in Americans and in the antibiotics that we feed our animals has really decimated our microbiome. And we can go on and on. Glyphosate, which started being used in the mid-1970s, glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic. It wasn't a weed killer. That was an accidental discovery. And glyphosate is a really good way of killing off the microbiome. And we now know that glyphosate by itself can cause leaky gut, and glyphosate's in everything. So all of our wheat has glyphosate. All of our oats have glyphosate. All of our corn has glyphosate, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things, it's not football season anymore, but during football season, I use the example of, so this microbiome was kind of like the offensive flanks that were protecting the quarterback, us, or our gut wall. And the linebackers are the lectins. And so you got this great front four, and the linebackers can't get through the front four. When you decimate the front four, now all of a sudden, the linebackers are coming through the front line, and the quarterback's getting sacked. And Aaron Rodgers is going, what the heck? Get these guys off of me. So you could have a great quarterback. You could have a great wall of your gut. But if you don't have the linebackers, these lectins, if you don't have the front four, the lectins have a great shot at even a great quarterback. And I think it's a pretty good analogy.
Now so let me ask you this. Are there, quote unquote, the healthy foods that people are pushing nowadays that in your mind are full of lectins that really people should minimize or avoid? What are those healthy foods that people really should look out for?
Well, grains in general are really mischief maker. And you're right. 100% of my people with leaky gut have antibodies to gluten. 100% of them. So there's, at least until you get the wall of your gut repaired and or you get your microbiome repaired, gluten really has no place in our modern day diet. The other sad thing is that oats contain a protein that cross-reacts with gluten. I'm sorry, it does. And I have so many patients who go, oh, I'm eating gluten-free. And they're eating corn and they're eating oats, and both of them cross-react with gluten. 70% of people who react to gluten react to corn and oats. 70%.
And I love what you said, because there's so many people. I'm in Texas, so everybody, I'm gluten-free and I eat a ton of corn.
Yeah.
And you're right. Corn to me is just like wheat on a stalk. I mean, that's really what it is. It's pretty bad like that. So when you talk about all of this, when you work with patients, are you testing? Are you more apt to look for just inflammation, leaky gut testing to say, these are in your diet, so I'm looking for leaky gut and inflammation? Or are there actually tests that you do that you can see if somebody's sensitive to lectins? I know that's kind of a goofy question, but what does that look like?
Yeah, you can test for lectin sensitivity. We use a company called Vibrant Wellness, and I worked with them a number of years ago to convince them that it might be worthwhile to test for lectin sensitivity. And sure enough, some people light up like a Christmas tree for lectins, poster children for lectins. Other people, not so much. But we can see which foods they react to and which they don't. On the other hand, a book like The Plant Paradox says, okay, here's the usual troublemakers. And my next to last book was Gut Check, which basically was everything I learned in 10 years following writing The Plant Paradox and testing patients every 3 months on foods they're tolerant to, foods they're not intolerant to. And these are not food allergies. These are food sensitivities, and they're very different. And some of the most common foods that you would have thought, oh, these are good for you, like ginger shows up all the time. And wait a minute, ginger settles your stomach. Well, I'm sorry, like 40% of my patients react to ginger. Lemons show up all the time. Cinnamon shows up all the time. And so it's like, who would have guessed? But it shows up all the time. White onions show up all the time. Yellow onions, no. And so in Gut Check, I go, okay, here's the top 12 of the most mischievous guys that I see in my patients. And you might not be one of them, but maybe you ought to consider that these could be your triggers.
Understandable. So we talked about all the things maybe we should avoid. You mentioned polyphenols and foods that are full of that because those gut bacteria need those to survive. I know you're a big proponent of things like olive oil, for instance. Like when you're looking for the ideal olive oil, what is that best looking olive oil for you? Because you know there's so much craziness out there with that. What's your take on that?
Well, my humble opinion is Gundry MD polyphenol-rich olive oil. Blatant plug. But it's funny how that story happened. I've been writing literally ever since Big Ed about polyphenols. And initially, I used to present at the International Polyphenol Conference every year. And polyphenols are plant protective compounds that plants use to protect themselves from sun damage, they protect their mitochondrial equivalent from damage, and they produce these as a protective agent. Now, we've known from a long time that when humans eat polyphenols, they're not well absorbed at all. But what we didn't know up until a few years ago is that bacteria love polyphenols, and they're a prebiotic for bacteria. And in turn, the bacteria then, the byproducts of their fermenting polyphenols make those available to us. And so they're the middleman, but the polyphenols were incredibly important for bacterial health. So how did I discover this polyphenol-rich olive oil? It's actually a really cute story. Do we have time? Can I tell?
Yeah, you go ahead. Go for it.
Okay. So there's a family in Morocco. They're fourth generation olive farmers, and they have 1.2 million olive trees in Morocco. Every generation, I guess, has to prove their worthiness to take over the family business. So the fourth generation, whose first name is Othmane, goes to his father, and Othmane is a wine connoisseur. And he says, great wines are great because of their polyphenol content. And the vines are planted in rocky soil. They're usually planted at high elevation. They're underwatered. They have to struggle, and they're miserable. And the more miserable the vine is, the more concentrated the polyphenols are in the grape. He said, I wonder what would happen if we planted olive trees like vines, and we put them real close together, and we planted them in rocks, and we planted them at high elevation in the Atlas Mountains, in the desert, and treated them exactly like vines. And his father said, well, that's a crazy idea, but prove it. So he gives him a plot of land, and he takes all the rocks and It takes apparently 5 years to get a crop of olives. So 5 years pass, and he presses the olives, and he takes it to his father, and father spits it out. And he says, this is horrible. This isn't even extra virgin. What a waste of time. You're a failure. I'm not sure if I'm going to give you the family business. And he takes it, Morocco used to be a French colony, so he takes it to the local tester for extra virgin olive oil. And the guy said, this is extra virgin. It's the right acidity, but this is really interesting flavor. Would you mind if I send it to Paris to the polyphenol olive expert over there and see what he thinks? And so he gets a call from this guy. He says, hey, are you this guy from Morocco? He says, yeah. He says, what the heck are you doing? There's 30 times more polyphenols in this olive oil than anything I've ever tested in the world. So he tells him the story. He says, of course. So he goes to his father. He said, I was right. And his father said, okay, smart guy. Who's going to buy this stupid stuff? And so he's at a trade show. And he brings along a bottle of the stuff, and he's complaining to his friends. And they said, well, you ever heard of a Dr. Gundry? He's a polyphenol nut. Why don't you send it to him? So I get a cold call sample. And, I take one swig. What the heck is this? The next thing I know, literally I'm on a plane to Morocco. And that's the history.
Rest is history. Oh my gosh.
And his father's very proud of him.
Being I've never met you before, I realize your desire to get to the bottom of things and figure this out is really what's led to your success. That's so crazy. So if people want to learn more about you and what you do in your books, where can they learn more about you?
Well, they can come to drgundry.com. They can come to gundrymd.com, which is my food and supplement company. The Dr. Gundry podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, my YouTube channels. I've got over 1 million subscribers. I've got 4 New York Times bestselling books, 11 books. Actually, I just put in the manuscript for the 11th book. And hopefully, I appear waving at you whenever you're scrolling through the internet or Instagram or Facebook, and hope I show up.
No, this has been great. Your whole approach to restorative medicine, finding those missing pieces, questioning maybe what people think is what's right or wrong is really what makes you unique. You cut through the noise. I love the analogies. I love the stories. And really, that's what people are looking for nowadays to make their health better. And I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me on. And yeah, you're right. I'm still like a kid in a candy store. My motivation is, how did Hippocrates know this? I mean, he knew it. And luckily, we now, with every passing year, we have the science that backs up everything he was talking about. And,
no, that's exactly it. The truth about how the body works just keeps on coming out. And you're right. It's amazing how we've known this for years. You've seen it with patients, but like you said, the science is catching up to where the things that we see every day. But I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Steve.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.